Hello, and welcome back to Processing the Process, where we capture and discuss the technical, psychological, and contextual dynamics that shape the process of creating a work of art. Week by week, moment by moment, we are following Jonathan Riddell, choreographer and artistic director of Riddell Dance Theater, as he creates his latest works for RDT's Second Story Dance Project. Today, we'll be focusing on Second Story's 76th rehearsal, which took place on May 23rd of 2018. Now, during the week leading into rehearsal, Jonathan had an opportunity to go to a studio at his alma mater, Purchase College, to create and practice his latest solo, which is going under the working name of Graveyard. Now, in the old days, so to speak, when John was with Lamone in the early days of RDT, he had many more opportunities to work on his own. But more recently, it's really rare, from what you've told me, John, that you have the chance to work alone in the studio. So it's as if when he is back by himself in that environment, he has to almost reacclimate to it. Now, since we weren't there, John, to witness what I'm sure would have been very interesting to see, would you kindly share with us what it was you worked on in that particular session?
In that particular session, I have to harken back. I definitely needed to warm up, which sometimes when you're on your own can be its own challenge. And I wanted to review all of the material I had created thus far for the solo, and fine-tune it more, work on making some spatial changes to the dance, particularly because the dance has phrases of material that repeat. And when they repeat, I wanted to do them using different facings of the body and travel them in different directions throughout the stage. So I'm using the same material, but taking it in different directions for a couple reasons. One, it shows the character moving in literal different directions, also figurative different directions, and it changes what we call the audience's eye. You have your audience looking in different areas on the stage, and it's showing different angles of the movement, the designs, and such of the dance. So I was really just trying to be quite smart about all of that. It wasn't a lot of physical work, it was a lot of mental work.
Right. So perhaps being alone was advantageous from that standpoint, where you really had the quiet time to focus.
Yeah, and I wasn't worried about other people's needs.
That's great.
Yeah, don't we all wish we had time to not worry about other people's needs? And I recall also the last phrase of movement that I had created also needed some tweaking in the movement itself. So,
Wow. Well, how do your creative process and experience of rehearsals differ when you're alone versus when you're working with your colleagues?
Well, sort of like I said, when I'm alone, I am a little bit freer. I try to not care about how I look or what people think of what's coming up for me spontaneously when we're in rehearsals together. But I certainly don't have to worry when I'm alone. The challenge is, of course, the discipline of keeping yourself going. If you lose a train of thought, getting yourself back on track. I can, easily go off on like thought tangents where suddenly I'm like not thinking about the piece anymore. I'm thinking about television or politics or some garbage like that. And, I'll be standing, it's almost like you're talking to yourself, or I'll just be like thinking to myself about something that crossed my mind, and I'm like, wait a minute, I need to be dancing now, and I need to be creating and moving. So, it's a little bit like being in your own head.
For me, that would be scary.
When you had mentioned something that we had talked about, that it was difficult for me this time to be alone and to reacclimate to that dynamic, and it's that dynamic that I'm speaking of. Like, oh right, I have to discipline myself. I have to warm myself up. I have to stay on track.
All falls to you.
Yeah.
Well, I think you did a great job, because what we saw subsequently was quite interesting, which I will get to in a moment. So here we are in the actual rehearsal, and Mandy is away on vacation, as we mentioned in the last video cast. And during that time, Jonathan had speculated about what he and Lorena might do in Mandy's absence, and there were a variety of choices, but he thought that it was likely that they would each work on their respective solos, and in fact, this is what occurred. So Jonathan arrived first, started warming up. A bit later, Lorena comes in with Sebastian. Of course, there is Sebastian with his stroller, jumping right into the action, which I have shared with John before, that I like now to call stroller derby. And
yes. I love that name.
It really, I think, tells you everything you need to know. So he's having a grand time, and then he comes over to me, and we're constructing and deconstructing Lego trucks, and then he's playing hide and seek with them with me. So I'm thinking, great, if I can keep him engaged, maybe Lorena can warm up a little while longer without interruption with Jonathan. And in fact, at least in the beginning, they were able to do that. And as we've noted, this is a period of time where they tend to catch up. And I think the topic of today's discussion were all of the latest developments in the dance world. But that didn't last too long, because soon enough, Sebastian needed Mom for a variety of reasons, and two stand out in particular. One, Lorena and John are warming up, and lo and behold, it's like Beethoven just went da-na-na-na on the piano. It should only have been Beethoven. But it was sufficiently disruptive that Lorena concluded, better get over there, and immediately entered into a negotiation with Sebastian. Okay, one more song for you, and then on to the next. And miraculously, it worked. So that was great. But shortly thereafter, Sebastian decides that it would be really cool if he takes his car with the big wheels and roll it along the mirrors, the ones that can crack. So Lorena quickly realizes, better stave this one off, and instead shows him how great it is if he can roll it along the wall and along the ballet bars in the back of the studio while chasing Mom. Oh, couldn't be a better suggestion. It worked, and I have to say that Lorena came up with some great diversionary tactics. Nonetheless, warm-up really became this integration, if you will, of exercising and caregiving. So it led me to wonder and pose a question to you, Jonathan. How did you experience this particular segment of rehearsal, the warm-up, with your partner literally going in and out and in and out 10,000 times?
It is tricky. It can be distracting, because you're, especially when you're warming up together, you're kind of vibing off of each other, and
good point.
maybe you are actually, giving each other exercises to to do. So you need each other for that. But and so yes, when one of them keeps coming and going, it feels like you also need to stop and start. So that can be tricky, but I don't know. It's also, again, it's par for the course in this situation we're in, and there were definitely times in the past where I would normally stop myself and really defer to Lori more, if that makes sense. Like if she stopped, I would stop and wait for her. But it's just gotten to the point where like we understand. It's like you just have to keep going, and the person who has to duck out and care for the children in that moment, they understand and they get it, and they're being physical too in their own way, helping with the children.
That's very
so
true.
They're doing their thing, and they will integrate themselves back with you as they can, when they can, how their body needs to. So we have to trust each other at that point. And I this particular day, I just kept going. I was like, great, Lori needs to do her thing. I'm going to keep going. She's going to come back in, and we're just going to let it flow that way. And I think that's what happened, and I think it was understood between the two of us that that's just how it needed to be.
Well, perhaps the term integration really is appropriate, and certainly from my perspective as an observer, because I imagine under other circumstances with other collaborations of dancers, it could be quite disjunctive. And admittedly, there will be moments, I'm sure, or particular days where it might in fact feel that way, but for the most part, it really appears to be almost like a seamless integration. This is the deal. Everybody knows, you're used to it, and it's as if, as the British say, that we just carry on and do the best that you can. So, with that in mind, Lorena and Sebastian choose a video that Sebastian actually knows how to manipulate, in the hopes that that will buy even more time for Lorena as she and Jonathan move into the part of rehearsal where they're going to work on their respective solos. So here's how I called it. It was a very interesting setup because I had Lorena on my left with earphones on, listening to her music. I had Jonathan on my right with no music and seemingly lost in thought. And as if piped in, the music that I hear is coming from Sebastian's video. So it's actually a rather surreal start to this phase of the rehearsal. And one of the questions that came into my mind at that time, as I'm watching both Lorena and you, Jon, is, gee, I wonder what it's like for you to be literally creating new material right next to a colleague who's doing the same thing.
Yes. Again, this is sort of similar to the warm-up. It has the potential to be quite distracting. It has the potential to be discombobulating. But I recall on this particular day, I was quite focused, and I remember it being comical. I remember thinking, man, this must look crazy, because I stood, I think, for at least like 15 minutes. I was just sort of standing, looking ahead of myself, but low, and really just thinking through everything I had done at the purchase rehearsal that we were talking about. And there were distractions going on. Lori was doing the exact opposite of me. She was completely frenetic. She was jumping and turning and twisting and darting across the room back and forth, listening to her music and responding to it and dancing with all this fervor and joy. And there I was, like like a pillar,
monastic,
in like a furious ocean, and but I let her energy kind of just, I was trying to like be zen about it and just let her energy wash around me, have Sebastian's video energy kind of wash around me, and for me to just stay focused. And I remember thinking to myself, man, I really should move. I should physicalize what I'm thinking, and but it just didn't seem right. I just needed to really get from, in my mind, from point A to point B to point C, remember everything that I had done a couple days ago, and to move felt like that would have been yet another piece of information, like another sensory, it would be like sensory overload.
Too much to juggle.
And I was getting all the work done in my head, and so I just didn't move. and I did it all up here. Yeah, it was bizarre, but that's what I needed to do in that moment, and it may have looked absolutely crazy, but hey,
but it was effective.
That's everyone else's tough luck, and my game. Thank you.
Well, so here we are. Lori was working on creating material for what will be section 3 of her piece, Voices. And from where I stood, I'm watching her develop very, very rapid steps, which I'm guessing are in sync with literally every beat of the music. That tends to be a Lorena hallmark. Even though I couldn't hear it, I was guessing about that.
You could see it in how she was dancing.
Right. That's what I figured. And her movements were very athletic. And after she determined her lower body steps, she introduced arm movements that for the most part were quite expansive. And at the same time, Jon was working on his graveyard solo, and sure enough, he has confirmed to us that my perception at that time was on target. It looked like he was doing a lot of thinking, minimal amount of movement, as if he were working out the details in his head, and in fact you were. So here I have this amazing opportunity to watch two choreographers who are creating in completely different, contrasting styles, side by side. I mean, it's a rare opportunity, and it was really a fascinating and a delight for me to be able to see this. And as you had said, Jon, here's Lorena zooming around the room, testing out her ideas in her body in sync with the music. And here's Jonathan, mostly stationary, creating and testing ideas primarily in his head. So, needless to say, I was wondering, and you began to answer this, Jon, could you take us into your head at that time? And you started to talk about it. I didn't know if there was anything further that you were trying to work through in that moment.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think I expressed sort of what the content was of my thoughts, like what I was trying to, everything I was trying to figure out and remember and work on in my mind. But I will add to this idea that of why moving felt like the wrong idea.
Right.
I had made such subtle tweaks to the material, especially, as I said, the idea of repeating phrases but doing them in different directions. Those can be very subtle differences, and I really needed to think through all the patterns that I had decided on before I executed them on my body, because if I had just gone with body memory, I probably would have started to do the wrong thing. And I didn't want to start sort of plugging that into my muscles and going for it but making mistakes. There's definitely a time for that, but this time I really was like, no. Think through this, because you're going to waste a lot of energy otherwise if you just sort of go for it without reviewing it all. So So again, that's why I really chose, and I made sure I went through the whole dance. I didn't want to begin on the wrong foot, so to speak.
Wow, and he's doing this on a day where his colleague is engaging in a process that's diametrically opposed. So it just highlighted your stationary body language even more than if you had been alone or everybody had been engaging in different kinds of things. So
and my piece is called Graveyard. I was, embodying a tomb at that moment.
oh, tomb, like monastic. Okay, so I'm seeing where these words are coming into my head from. The images are really staying and haunting me.
Sure.
I better stop right here. So Lorena winds up creating approximately 30 seconds of material, and she quickly reviews what she's done on the video and decides, I'm going for more. And she continues to experiment with choreographic ideas, testing each nuance with her body. And I'm really quite struck by the speed with which she seems to be making decisions. Keep it, change it, discard it. Boom, 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 boom. At lightning speed, again, in tremendous contrast with the legato pace of your thought process. So much so, apparently, that when she finished, she literally collapsed flat out on the floor. She just couldn't even move. So it was quite interesting, but apparently fulfilling. Meanwhile, I see Jonathan come on back against the mirror behind us, and he opens up a notebook. Well, being the nosy person I guess I am, I kind of sidled over a little bit. And
I could feel you. I could feel this little mouse like behind my ear, hearing.
It's like I requested a peek. I didn't want to disturb him, but I needed to know what this was. So, it looked to me as if Jon was graphically mapping out where each phrase exists in space and the direction it would move in to get to the next phrase. So, Jon, would you say that that's a pretty accurate description of what you were doing? And part two, how often do you find yourself using this tool while creating?
That is an accurate description of what I was doing. And as I said earlier, the sort of subtle changes in direction as each phrase repeats. I had reviewed it all in my mind and then decided I need to visualize it on paper and record it on paper. Again, before I waste a lot of physical energy rehearsing it, let me write all this down and see it. And it did really help. How often do I do that? It's interesting. I think each piece is different. It's not something I do for every piece, but actually, now that I think about it, I think I do it quite often, especially as a way to record those important geometric patterns of the piece. I particularly remember doing it often when I was younger and making work, and would, typically it would come out of doing some work at home before I got to the studio, and wanting to make sure I, had it written down. Or if I was thinking through a piece at home. I think when I really got into a groove of working with my company and we were having rehearsals much more regularly, I didn't need to do it so much anymore because I had the dancers to work it out on, or I could just tell them, oh, okay, well, so change this direction, blah blah blah. And when you have that, when you have at least two minds working on it, it's much easier to work out. It's much easier to remember. Either you'll remember or they will remember, and you can trust each other to do that and to remind each other. So there's not this sort of urgent need to have it recorded necessarily. Here I found myself, again, working on primarily by myself, on a solo for myself, and I'm the only mind working on this. So
Right.
I was like, I really better pick up that old tool, use that old device, and get this recorded and thought through.
Well, it seems as if whether you knew it in advance or not, between your solo rehearsal at Purchase and what could have been characterized as your solo rehearsal for this particular session, and your work in your notebook, that it seemed that you intuited that it was precisely what you needed for the reasons that you described. So it's as if, whether or not you knew it fully, it became fully known as you went down those paths. But actually, that leads me to an off-the-cuff question, which is, would you say that you're traveling down those kinds of paths and knowing that they exist is something that comes with experience? That you kind of, it seemed that you just understood innately what it was you were going to need to do to accomplish what you were hoping to achieve?
I think so. That's a very interesting question. Certainly experience helps. Anytime you're needing tools and you have a variety of them in your back pocket, let's say, experience will help you decide what to pull out. But I also think it's sort of I think it's also trusting yourself. I'm thinking about this example specifically. I remember standing there in my monastic stance and thinking through everything, and then just this sort of clear flash of a notebook page with a drawing on it flashed into my mind, and it was just this very it was this sort of visual cue of, oh, I'm telling myself I should do this. I should go through this type of process to help me get the info I need and to get it down and recorded. So it was just a flash, but I then instinctively knew what to do. And
Right.
And I think those types of things have always come to me again instinctivally, and then I trust that instinct because I remember doing this very early on as a student and choreographing, like just suddenly being like, oh, I need to write that down, and I need to write it down in words, or I need to write it down with pictures, or let me record this, so or let me go grab someone and try it out, and you, if you trust that there's no taboo, there's there's no reason you can't pick up a journal and write in it. There's no reason you can't pick up a video camera. There's now as technology has changed, I've had to come up with new ways of recording, or not. I didn't need to come up with them, but there are all these new ways of recording, and new ways of playing with material, using video. If you recall, Sherri, when I was working on Rite of Spring, I actually, it clicked in my mind because I was desperate to see how these different phrases would work if I sort of cut out certain sections and smash them together. But I didn't have the time with the dancers to figure that out. And then it just occurred to me, I was like, but I have video. And I have video editing tools on my computer. So I took rehearsal footage and literally cut and pasted the video images together of the dancers doing the movement as if I were doing that in rehearsal. And then I was able to take that video and show it to the dancers and say, here's the new phrase, all edited for you. Can you learn it in this sequence? And I even posted on YouTube and sent them an email and said, by the way, for next rehearsal, do you have a few minutes to take a look at this at home? And nobody taught me to do that, and I'm not saying I'm the first person who's ever done that or the only person who does that, but again, it just came out of, what do I need? I need to be able to see this. Okay, how do I do that? And trusting your instincts and your ingenuity.
Well, you really, it seems, have outlined a number of pieces that have to align. One, your instinctive inclinations, and as you say, trusting those instincts. Next, your vast experience in doing so. And what I recall from working on the book with Jonathan actually is your reference often to your toolbox. And in fact, those conversations, as I recall, had a lot to do with your role as a professor and coming into your classes with a plethora of options that you could pick and choose from depending upon how things played out that day. But it seems that what you're describing to us today has as an inherent requirement the knowledge that there are tools to use, the fact that you can access tools, and as you say, there are no rights and wrongs here, that you can do so in any way you see fit at any time. But I think all of the elements that you have touched on, it seems to me, are critical to being able to have it kind of come together and work for you in the way that you need. So it was very interesting to watch that. And subsequently, Jonathan worked on a particular gesture phrase that he began to create in rehearsal. And did so literally movement by movement, I guess, in keeping with the painstaking approach of the day. And it seemed to me he was continually making very subtle adjustments of his fingers, hands, arms. Many of these gestures were, to me, reminiscent of ones that I remembered from Brittle Branches. And some of his, what I call hand-on-face gestures, reminded me not only of Brittle Branches, but of Embers and Ash and some other works that Jon has done in the past. And then Jon moved on playing with various leg movements, swaying from side to side, crossing one over the other, doing what are called ronds de jambes. And finally, he starts adding these very staccato-like movements or rhythm, a staccato-like rhythm to his arm movements. And again, I immediately thought of your other works. So can you remind us, Jon, of why you want to reference Brittle Branches in your graveyard choreography?
Yes. I can think of at least two reasons. I'm sure there are many more. I think, for one, it's coming. I'm pulling my punches on that comment. Let me
Okay.
go with comment number 2. Comment number 2 is that I intend for these dances to be performed together.
Right.
And I have a solo called Lemon Grove that I created for Lisa Yanacito McBride, one of my dancers. And this piece, Graveyard, is very much a complement to that. It could be performed by the same dancer, one after the other, or two different dancers, but they're sort of, in my mind, they're a diptych. They are two bookend kind of pieces, and I envision that the piece to follow this solo would be Brittle Branches. So they create a suite, and from there, Embers and Ash would also be a part of this sort of collection of dances, and possibly another old solo also that I created for Lisa called Hollowed Bomb. So I'm sort of pulling actual dances from my archives, as well as ideas and motifs from those dances, and trying to swirl them around with these new dances so that they really can work together as one beautiful thought. So there's a tricky balance that I need to find with that intention of having some references from one to the other so that they do work well together. There is some connection, some follow through, and at the same time making sure that each one is its own distinct voice, that one doesn't just blend into the other, and you eventually get just a wash of the same material. So each piece needs its own unique elements to it, but also complementary or exact same references from one to the next.
And I imagine, of course, there's no formula to determine.
And there is no formula. There are tools and devices. There are structures that I can think about, and all of which I've either explored or learned from other choreographers and teachers. But no, there is no formula. So there's a lot of painstaking work.
Absolutely.
That at least I care to do. Other people perhaps go much more instinctively into the process, but I'm really trying to push also my vocabulary and not always sort of do what my body would habitually do. I'm trying to challenge myself to come up with new shapes, new designs, at least for my work.
Well, it'll be interesting for us to see as the process continues where Jon is choosing to emphasize continuity and where he's choosing perhaps to emphasize innovation. And perhaps we can question him and delve into his mind at that time to determine how you made those particular choices. So while Jon was in this final phase of the work in rehearsal, we can't forget about Sebastian, and he won't let us. So he comes zooming center stage with his stroller, of course. And perhaps this was the next segment of Stroller Derby, and he is running around and around and around with this stroller within maybe a foot of Jonathan. And I'm thinking to myself, all right, Jon's continuing to do his thing, and I wonder how long it's going to take before you have to abandon what you're doing. But Lorena comes in and saves the day and comes up with another great idea and positions herself all the way on the other side of the studio and calls Sebastian over and has him run around her, doing his stroller derby with her at the center. And somehow to him, this was a brilliant idea. And it worked. And it allowed Jonathan to finish up, because Lorena, as you may recall, was flat on the floor. So she was fine to stand there and not move. And now maybe you were reversing roles just a bit. So at the end of the session, Jonathan, you may remember, characterizes today's rehearsal as progress in baby steps. And I think, John, that Lorena would agree with you, particularly because she was interrupted so many times and yet was still able to create that solid 30 seconds of material and play with the next phrase or two. So baby steps, yes, but distinctly productive. And then I thought in my mind, and want to pose to you as our final question tonight, would you say that progress in baby steps is a fitting description of the second story process in general?
I think it sums it up quite accurately. We talked about it on a previous videocast that I'm really getting used to just these short spurts of progress, of creativity, and sort of embracing it, chewing on it, letting it simmer until the next week when we get that little chunk. It's very much the pace of that we've found, and now that I'm used to working with it, I'm sort of I kind of get it. I think.
Yeah.
Like, oh, okay. I see how this works. Okay.
I think they have all gotten it, I must say, and I think it becomes a treat for us to see just how you get it each rehearsal, because while there are similar underlying dynamics, the way in which they play out, of course, is always unique. So we thank you for joining us once again this evening, and there's lots to look forward to and lots to investigate moving forward. And thank you, Jon, as always, for allowing us to peek inside of your brain. It's a treat for us. It must be a little strange for you, but thank you for indulging me and our colleagues. And please do join us next week for another round of Processing the Process. Thank you and good night.